welcome to the Talking Crop podcast. My name is Kathryn Seebruck, and I'm a commercial agriculture educator with University of Illinois Extension, serving Daviess-Stephenson-Winnebago counties. Talking Crop is a row crop production podcast, and episodes typically occur every other week during the growing season, but we're putting out some special bonus episodes throughout January to spotlight each of the presenters joining us at the Northwest Illinois Agronomy Summit, happening January 28th at Highland Community College in Freeport. The Northwest Illinois Agronomy Summit is a one-day conference tailored towards corn and soybean producers, agribusiness representatives, and ag agency professionals to provide them with the latest in agronomic research from university faculty and extension specialists. Our goals are to provide producers with applied information they can implement on their farms and to give agriculture professionals the knowledge they need to serve the farmers they work with. You can register online for the Northwest Illinois Agronomy Summit at go.illinois.edu/agsfreeport, or you can call our Stephenson County office at 815-235-4125. Registration is $25 and includes lunch. 5 continuing education units will be available for certified crop advisors. As of last year, this program has been adopted across the state, and you can find a list of all agronomy summits in the series at go.illinois.edu/agronomy summits. As mentioned previously, these special bonus episodes are meant to introduce you to our speakers and give you a taste of what they will be speaking on at the Agronomy Summit in Freeport on January 28th. The next guest for our bonus episodes is yours truly. My presentation is titled Producer Enemy Number 1, The Case Against Waterhemp, and I will be discussing everything you want to know about waterhemp and highlighting the best management practices that can and should be utilized to best control it. Please enjoy this special bonus episode of Talking Crop with me, Kathryn Seebruck. I will be speaking at the Northwest Illinois Agronomy Summit on January 28th. We hope to see you there. Now, this episode is a weird one for me because I'm used to conversing with someone and also being the one to ask the questions, not the one doing the talking. So bear with me as I navigate this first ever monologued episode of Talking Crop. As with the other bonus episodes, I wanted to start off by giving some of my background. So I'm actually a bit of an odd man out because I don't come from a farm background. I wasn't born or raised on a farm and my family didn't farm. But instead, my love for agriculture stemmed from grade school and high school courses, and a very long and winding educational path eventually found me in a weed science lab in college, which is how I ended up with a grad degree in weed science from University of Illinois. Specifically, I was in a molecular and genomic weed science lab that studied herbicide resistance, and I looked at resistance to PPO-inhibiting herbicides, or the Group 14 herbicides, in waterhemp and Palmer amaranth. So weed science, as I like to say, is my bread and butter. I'm a weed scientist by training, and that's why I'm going to be talking about weed science at the Northwest Illinois Agronomy Summit coming up here on January 28th at Highland Community College in Freeport. As I mentioned in the introduction, my presentation at Agronomy Summit is specifically on water hemp. And the reason I chose water hemp, besides the fact that that's obviously where my interests lie, is that water hemp is a commonly cited pain point for producers. So on farm visits, it very commonly comes up as a struggle that producers are contending with every growing season. And so I wanted to use my time at the Agronomy Summit to talk about water hemp and why it is such a problematic weed, why it's so difficult to control, but also why it's so important that we do the best that we can to control it. Because my educational philosophy is such that I like to provide a lot of that foundational background information on a topic because I think that that really helps us, it helps bolster our understanding of the more applied information that we're trying to put across. And so, it's one thing for me to say, water hemp is a bad weed. Water hemp needs X, Y, and Z tactics for best control. But I think it's another for me to provide the background information that really gets at the core of why water hemp is so competitive, why it's so good at evolving resistance. And the more we understand those whys, the better we understand what management practices are going to be the most effective at combating those characteristics that water hemp possesses. And so that's what I'm going to be doing during my presentation at the Agronomy Summit. So my presentation is titled Producer Enemy Number 1, The Case Against Water Hemp. So we've got kind of a cheesy little theme associated with it. And the gist of my presentation, it's going to start out by going over the biology of water hemp. So we'll be covering the relevant biological characteristics that will help us understand why water hemp is such a competitive weed species. Then we'll, of course, talk about the history of resistance in water hemp and the status of resistance in water hemp as well. Then we'll talk about how water hemp competes with our crops, how it spreads, and then we will round it out by covering those best management practices that should be utilized to best control this really troublesome weed species. And of course, I'm not going to be giving my full presentation during this episode by any means. We have to leave something up to the imagination for folks who are joining us at the Agronomy Summit here in a couple of weeks. But instead, I want to use this time to talk about a topic in my presentation that I won't be able to give enough time to during the summit. And that topic, of course, I'm sure it will come as no surprise to anybody, is herbicide resistance. As I mentioned earlier, resistance was my focus during my time in graduate school, and as such, it's something that not only morbidly fascinates me, but it's something that I feel really strongly about. I feel it's very important to understand resistance, understand that it is an issue, and understand how important it is that we mitigate the spread of resistance, because we all know that farming is very difficult, and we all know that farming is very expensive. And if we don't mitigate resistance and we don't nip that problem in the bud, it's only going to worsen, and that's going to lead to us having less and less options available to us to control our weeds. And that's going to turn into a very expensive situation, and that's just not a road that we want to go down. So when we talk about resistance, we typically always start by talking about glyphosate. And that's not because glyphosate resistance was the first documented resistance. That's certainly not the case. But it's because glyphosate was such a revolutionary product and really brought resistance to the forefront of everyone's minds. So glyphosate, it was a very good product. It worked really, really well. And its use was then proliferated by the introduction of glyphosate-resistant corn and soybean hybrids and varieties. That enabled us to use even more glyphosate, and I would hazard to say it led to the overuse of glyphosate. And when you overuse a herbicide, if you overuse any tactic for weed management, really, plants, the weeds, they're going to adapt to that. So the best thing that we can do is do what we can to keep the weeds guessing. And continual overuse of herbicide chemistries is definitely not that. So when herbicide resistance really started to become an issue, of course, weed scientists started to research that issue very heavily. And for many years, the focus on herbicide resistance research was on target site resistance. And target site resistance, just some background information and some vocab here. So herbicides work by binding to a target site within a plant. And the target site is the physiological location within the plant. And it's typically going to be an enzyme. So herbicides with a specific site of action, that site of action is that enzyme in the plant. And the herbicide will bind to that enzyme and disrupt it in some way. And the disruption of that enzyme will result in the plant dying in some fashion. And so that's essentially how herbicides work, by targeting those sites of action. And the mechanism by which the plant dies, we call that the mode of action of the herbicide. So when a plant evolves resistance to a herbicide and it evolves target site resistance, what happens is there is a genetic change in the gene that encodes that enzyme that the herbicide typically binds to, such that the enzyme structure changes so that the herbicide is no longer physically able to bind to the enzyme, and thus the plant will survive an application of that herbicide. And target site resistance, I like to say, is a very simple form of resistance. As I've mentioned, a specific change in a specific gene causes resistance to a specific herbicide mode of action. And we studied that. We studied target site resistance for a very long time. That's what we really focused on because that's mostly what we were seeing. We characterized a lot of target site resistance in many different weeds against many different herbicides. And then the focus of weed science research really shifted over the past few years towards what we call non-target site resistance. And this is a much more complex version of resistance or form of resistance because instead of just one gene being changed or one portion of a gene being changed, now we're seeing it's multiple genes being involved or multiple changes happening or occurring that are resulting in the plant being able to survive these herbicide applications. And these changes are enabling the plant to break down or metabolize the herbicide before it even has a chance to reach that target site, that enzyme that it's trying to target. And with this, what makes it so complicated, in addition to the fact that we're seeing multiple genes being involved, which makes it really hard to pinpoint where these changes are occurring. But what's more is that a lot of the times when these plants are able to metabolize these herbicides, they're able to metabolize more than one herbicide chemistry. So instead of the plant being resistant only to, let's say, an HPPD inhibitor via that breakdown of the product, weed science researchers are also seeing these plants being able to metabolize not just the HPPD inhibitors, but also, say, a synthetic auxin. And what's more is that in a lot of these instances, these plants that are resistant to some of these herbicides that they're metabolizing, they had never been exposed to those herbicides before. And that's what really complicates and muddies the waters and makes it really difficult for us to understand what all chemistries these populations are potentially going to be resistant to. And as a result, that makes mitigation of this resistance really, really difficult because with target site resistance, again, it was simpler in the sense that it was easier to understand, but also simpler to mitigate because what we preached was just to rotate your chemistries or to tank mix your chemistries so that if you happen to have a glyphosate resistant population, well, just make sure you rotate away from glyphosate the next season or mix glyphosate with another herbicide chemistry so that if you did happen to have glyphosate resistant individuals, even though the glyphosate wouldn't control them, well, that other chemistry would because they weren't resistant to that other chemistry. But when it comes to non-target site resistance, again, we don't always know what chemistries these populations are going to be able to metabolize. So it's kind of a guess on what herbicides should be used to help control these resistant populations. And so that's why weed science research has really focused towards non-target site resistance because it's something that we really need to get our hands on and understand it to help us better understand how best to mitigate that resistance. One common theme, though, that is something that we can say for certain is that we can't use herbicides or we can't continue to use herbicides to solve a problem that is caused by herbicides. Instead, one of those best management practices that we'll be talking about is diversification of our weed management tactics. So not only using herbicides, but using some other practice as well. And of course, this is going to look different across operations. One tactic that is very commonly being researched more and more is the use of cover crops. Now, of course, cover crops typically are going to be used for their soil health benefits, but they have that really good secondary effect of also being a weed control tactic. And actually, Dan Smith, one of the presenters at the Agronomy Summit this year, he's going to be talking about utilizing cover crops for weed control. So we're really excited to have Dan talk about that, and we're really interested to hear what results they came up with in their research. And so that's where I am going to leave you. Again, herbicide resistance is a very serious issue that needs to be understood so that we better mitigate it and do the best that we can to control these really problematic weed species that are really good at evolving resistance. And so I hope to see you all at the Agronomy Summit in Freeport on January 28th at Highland Community College, where we can talk more about this and more about water hemp.